Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Thursday, August 8th, 2024. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today, the U.S. to let Israel restart Gaza war after deal. So the U.S. is ready to guarantee that it would allow Israel to restart the genocidal war in Gaza after the first phase of any hostage and ceasefire deal that might be reached with Hamas. And this was reported all over Israeli media. This came out a few days ago. It's something I didn't pick up till today. And I think it's kind of important because this is saying that, this idea that President Biden or that the U.S. want to actually end this thing for good just isn't true. Hostage deal talks have been stalled since the Israeli killing of Hamas's political chief, Ismail Haniyeh, and it's unclear when they will resume, but the U.S. and Israel have been discussing potential proposals. And one of these proposals that's been discussed would involve 3 phases where Israel would halt its military operations and Hamas would release hostages. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu wants a guarantee that he'll be able to restart military operations after the first phase, which is when negotiations will be held on implementing the next 2 phases. So there's something very revealing about this, is the fact that, and this is the way that the Israeli media, reports frame this, is that Israel's basically asking permission from the U.S. that it would be able to restart military operations if it wanted to after the first phase of the deal. And based on, the hostage deals that have been on the table, I would guess that the first phase, most of them have been a 6-week ceasefire. So 6 weeks, initial hostage and prisoner exchange, and then Israel wants to be able to restart things after that. And so the U.S. has not given Israel a guarantee in writing yet, but they've just expressed support for the idea. And these reports say that the U.S. won't actually give them the guarantee in writing until they reach a deal with Hamas. But this condition, this thing that Israel wants will make a deal much less likely. I mean, forget everything else that's happening right now with all the regional escalations. Let's say they started talks again and you have Israel trying to get a guarantee that they'll be able to restart military operations after the first 6-week ceasefire. Hamas's main demand has been that they want a permanent ceasefire and Israeli withdrawal. So that's not going to, fly with that. Now, during the negotiations in June and July, Hamas did end up agreeing to language that was vague enough that Israel did not think that they would have to commit to a ceasefire, a permanent ceasefire, and withdrawal up front at one point, because Netanyahu kept saying that he wasn't going to end this thing. Hamas asked for the Israeli withdrawal and everything to happen in the beginning, and then they backed down on that demand and went back to this vague language that left things kind of open for interpretation. And then when that happened, that's when Netanyahu started making all these new demands about controlling the Egypt border and screening Palestinians who were returning to North Gaza, which was a very obvious attempt at sabotaging the chances of a deal. So I think this new thing that Israel wants and that the U.S. is apparently willing to give will make Hamas much less likely to agree to anything. And this is, I remember Kamala Harris, this was before she was the one running for president. She gave a speech at some event or some university or something, and she said, and that's why we need an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. And everybody started clapping. And then she said, while everybody was clapping, she said, for 6 weeks, just for 6 weeks. Because, they're not interested in really ending this. I think that's very clear. I think one of the reasons why the U.S. might be willing to give this guarantee is because, they want to secure a ceasefire here before the election, and they don't care if it's going to be temporary or permanent or whatnot. The next one here, Hamas says that it will continue ceasefire talks under Sinwar. So a Hamas official has said the Palestinian group will continue ceasefire negotiations with Israel after it appointed Yahya Sinwar as the head of the political bureau following the assassination of Haniyeh in Tehran. So Sinwar is Hamas's leader in Gaza, and the appointment makes him the top political official as well. Osama Hamdan told Anadolu Agency, quote, "The negotiations were managed by the leadership, and Sinwar was not far from the negotiation process. He was part of its details," end quote. So Haniyeh was the highest level Hamas official outside of Gaza, but Hamas officials said that Sinwar was always involved in the negotiations, in the talks. Essentially, that Sinwar always had the final say, as far as I understand it. So Hamdan, this Hamas official, said, quote, "The problem was not Hamas, but Israel, Netanyahu, and the U.S., which was not sincere in its mediation or in its attempt to push for a ceasefire," end quote. So the other thing, Israeli officials just said recently that negotiations aren't going to happen until after Iran's expected reprisal attack. So it's been a few days now. There was reports over the weekend that it was going to be Sunday, Monday. We still haven't seen the Iranian attack. There's all sorts of things, reports about when it might happen. I didn't really bother covering that because, we're not going to know until it happens. There's also reports saying that Iran might be reconsidering. Some of those I'm not too sure about. But we'll see what happens in the coming days. But that's a big factor, of course. If this does turn into full-blown regional war, chances of a hostage deal, are going to be gone, I think. All right, so the next one here. Israeli media publishes video of soldiers raping a Palestinian prisoner. This is from Middle East Eye. So Israeli media has published footage purportedly showing the moment soldiers in an infamous detention facility raped a Palestinian detainee. Late last month, 9 Israeli soldiers were arrested for the alleged rape of a Palestinian detained in Sedi Taiman, a facility in southern Israel's Negev desert. This is the notorious torture facility. So Israeli media actually published the video of the incident. It was released by Channel 12, and it shows these Israeli soldiers going up to a Palestinian, and what they do is they put like shields around the Palestinian riot shields as they do the deed that apparently lasted, according to the stuff that we're getting out of the case, it was a 10-minute rape, and it was multiple Israeli soldiers who were involved here, and now it's released by Israeli media on video, so there's no denying that this is what happened here. So really brutal stuff that's going on in these Israeli facilities. All right, so the next one here, Syrian Arab tribes attack U.S.-backed Kurds. So on Wednesday, Arab tribesmen launched a major attack on the U.S.-backed Kurdish SDF in eastern Syria's Deir ez-Zor province, and reports say that U.S. helicopters helped defend the Kurdish forces. So another conflict here that the U.S. is involved in. So according to the Daily Sabah, which is a Turkish media outlet, the Arab tribes attacked 7 villages, including Dibin, which is only a few kilometers from the Al Omar oil field that houses SDF fighters and U.S. troops. So this is very close to a U.S. base, U.S.-occupied oil field in eastern Syria. Local residents told Sputnik that at least 3 civilians were killed and 7 more were injured during the fighting. The SDF and Arab tribes also suffered casualties, but the number is unclear. The operation was the most significant attack since heavy fighting between the Arab tribes and the SDF broke out in August 2023, and that lasted several months. The Arab tribes took over some villages. They ended up pulling out of them, but that was going on for a while. And there's been like sporadic clashes between these two groups, but This is the most significant attack since last year. The SDF, again, this is the Kurdish, the U.S.-backed Kurds, they said in a statement, quote, "In the late hours of yesterday evening and continuing into this morning, Syrian regime-backed mercenaries and groups of the so-called National Defense Forces launched a ground attack against areas on the eastern banks of the Euphrates River, east of Deir ez-Zor," end quote. So Al-Mayadeen reported that during the clashes, U.S. helicopters used machine guns to target Arab tribesmen along the bank of the Euphrates River. And the UK-based Syrian Observatory for Human Rights also reported that U.S. aircraft used machine guns against the western bank of the Euphrates. So in Deir ez-Zor, you have the Euphrates River that kind of divides the U.S.-occupied territory and what is under Syrian government control. The U.S. and the SDF occupy the areas to the east of the river. To the west is the Syrian government, and where you have these Arab tribes. And so this attack, I mean, this is just another thing, with tensions high in the region. Again, this is something that the U.S. is probably directly involved in to some point, with maybe some air support for the Kurds. The U.S. also reinforced its base at Al-Omar as these clashes broke out. And Syria, I think, could be a target of major attacks. If Iran and its allies end up going with a big coordinated attack, I think there's a good chance that U.S. bases in Syria will come under attack, and then maybe these Arab tribes will get in on it as well and try to take some of this territory from the Kurds that they want. So this is something to keep an eye on. All right, so the next one here, Hezbollah commander killed in Israeli drone strike in southern Lebanon. This one is from Jason Ditz. An Israeli drone strike killed 2 people on a motorcycle in the southern Lebanon town of Juaya in southern Lebanon's Tyre district. One of the slain was identified as Hassan Fares Jeshi, a Hezbollah commander who was reportedly with the anti-tank missile arm of the faction. The other killed has yet to be identified. In addition, the Lebanese health ministry reported that 6 locals were injured in the strike. Israel also launched an attack against the border town of Aitarun, also in southern Lebanon, and wounded at least 2 people there. There was no word from either side as to why this area was attacked. So there's other shelling, Israeli shelling in other southern Lebanese towns. And earlier in the day, Hezbollah fired rockets against the Israeli border town of Shlomi. They reported direct hits, although there was no immediate reports of damage from the attack. So these types of attacks continue. Still haven't seen a major escalation from Hezbollah in response to the Israeli airstrike that killed their military commander in Beirut. But Nasrallah, is saying something big is going to happen. So we'll see. All right, so the next one here, the U.S. has dozens of secret bases across the Middle East, and they keep getting attacked. This article is from Nick Turse at The Intercept. So he gets into how U.S. troops in Iraq and Syria have come under repeated attacks in recent weeks. In the aftermath, in the wake of October 7th, they came under attack over 100 times in Iraq and Syria from then until January. And it ended with, well, it didn't end, but it culminated with 3 U.S. troops being killed at Tower 22, which is a very secretive base in Jordan on the Syrian border. And since then, there's been less rocket attacks, but they've increased recently. So Turse did an investigation into the number of U.S. bases in the region because a lot of these are secretive, like Tower 22. The Jordanian government did not want its people knowing about that base because they are not really thrilled about Jordan's cooperation with the U.S. So The Intercept launched an investigation and developed a list of more than 60 U.S. bases, garrisons, or shared foreign facilities in the Middle East. So there's more than 60 of them, and these sites range from small combat outposts to massive air bases in 13 countries: Bahrain, Egypt, Iraq, Israel, Jordan, Kuwait, Lebanon, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Syria, the United Arab Emirates, and Yemen. So interesting stuff here. And that reminds me, he mentions Yemen. There's not really any details about that, what facilities the U.S. has in Yemen in this story. But I remember this was a while ago now, but, every once in a while the president tells Congress where U.S. troops are deployed. And they usually say that there's a small number of troops in Yemen. They say that they're there to fight Al-Qaeda, but they haven't been fighting Al-Qaeda in Yemen in a while. It's been focused on the Houthis, of course, so it's not exactly clear where that base is. And Lebanon, there's about 75 U.S. troops deployed in Lebanon. They give military aid to Lebanon. They consider Hezbollah a terrorist organization, even though they're the most effective military there and a very popular political party. But the U.S. gives aid to Lebanon as well and has troops there that I think if things really escalate, they would probably evacuate those troops. They've been talking about doing that. But anyway, it's just, there's a lot of bases, and these are a lot of potential targets. Again, if things really heat up, I don't think we would see this right away. But if things really escalated and Iran wanted to really hit some U.S. bases with their ballistic missiles, they have a lot of targets to choose from. All right, so the next one here, I left up the one yesterday about the majority of Americans opposing the U.S. defending Israel. The next one here, AIPAC spent $9 million to help oust Cori Bush. This article's from Mondo Weiss. So Representative Cori Bush, I think she's considered a member of the squad. She lost her primary to a pro-Israel candidate, Wesley Bell, in Missouri's 1st District. And she was massively outspent by Bell, whose campaign was largely funded by outside groups. The American Israel Public Affairs Committee, AIPAC, spent $9 million on the race, and Democratic Majority for Israel spent $500,000. So lots of AIPAC money. Bush has been a target of pro-Israel groups since she was elected to the House over her support for Palestinian freedom and self-determination. Jewish Voice for Peace Action Political Director Beth Miller told Mondo Weiss, quote, her consistency has been really key. Since October 7th and since Israel's genocidal assault and attacks on Palestinians over the last 9 months, she's been consistently and loudly speaking out, end quote. And then she goes on to say that even before October 7th, she'd been pushing for an end to the unconditional flow of U.S. military aid to Israel. So she's out, and AIPAC, I mean, if you look at their Twitter account, they're always, bragging about how their what they call their grassroots activists helped, people beat these, what they call these anti-Israel candidates. So very, just they really rub it in your face that this lobby group that's lobbying the U.S. politicians on behalf of a foreign country is helping sway U.S. elections. And they've really been putting a lot of money behind it lately. All right, and it was Thomas Massie recently when he did that interview with Tucker Carlson said that every member of Congress, at least every Republican as far as he was aware of, has an AIPAC handler. Except for him. He has rejected AIPAC, and they call him all sorts of names for that. All right, so the next one here. Governor Walz has refused to meet with Palestinian families. This one is from Middle East Eye. It's been 10 months since Israel's war on Gaza began, and Governor Tim Walz, the newly appointed vice presidential nominee on Kamala Harris's ticket, has yet to meet with the Palestinian families from his home state of Minnesota, anti-war activists have told Middle East Eye. The accusations are in stark contrast to the public image being conjured up by the Democratic Party establishment to present Walz along with presidential hopeful Kamala Harris as more sympathetic and empathetic toward the carnage suffered by Palestinians over the past 10 months. In March, Walz lauded the uncommitted movement, describing the initiative to pressure Joe Biden for a ceasefire engaged. So he said, nice things about that. But according to several activists in Minnesota, not only has the governor refused to meet with Palestinian families who have lost relatives in Israel's war on Gaza, he has barely acknowledged their concerns and demands. So This is Sana Walz, the chapter leader and education coordinator for American Muslims for Palestine, Minnesota, told Middle East Eye the Palestinian community had been trying for months to arrange a meeting with the governor to talk about the devastating losses in Gaza and their demands for an arms embargo on Israel. When they did manage to arrange a meeting with the governor for early July through the Council on Islamic American Relations, it was canceled even before it began. So, we've kind of seen this. You see people, it's really something that you see some of these people, these Democrats, call what Israel is doing in Gaza a genocide, yet they want to support the Kamala Harris ticket when she's been the vice president of the country that is aiding and abetting that genocide. And Walz really, he's paid some lip service to the some things when it comes to Gaza, but overall he's very pro-Israel and not expected to really, try to change things as the vice president if he gets the spot. All right, so the next one here, Ukraine launches incursion into Kursk. So Russia said on Wednesday that its forces were fighting off a Ukrainian ground incursion into Russia's Kursk Oblast, an attack Russian President Vladimir Putin called a large-scale provocation. So far, Ukrainian officials have been quiet about the cross-border attacks, which was launched from Ukraine's Sumy Oblast. So Ukrainian officials have not officially acknowledged this attack. According to RT, the Russian military estimates up to 1,000 Ukrainian soldiers with dozens of armored vehicles entered Kursk. Drone attacks were also reported, and Kursk acting governor Alexei Smirnov said one of these drones hit an ambulance, killing 2 paramedics. In a meeting with his top officials, Putin said Ukrainian forces attacking Kursk were, quote, firing indiscriminately from different types of weapons, including rockets at civilian buildings, residential houses, and ambulances, end quote. You see a picture here shared by the governor of a house that he said was hit by a Ukrainian strike. The Russian Defense Ministry said on Wednesday that the fighting in Kursk was ongoing and said that it thwarted a breakthrough. The ministry said 5 residents of Kursk have been killed in the Ukrainian attack and claimed that it inflicted 260 casualties on the invading Ukrainian force. So as of Wednesday, they say the fighting is still ongoing, but they said they were able to stop them from, pushing further into the territory. But it's definitely a big cross-border attack here. As far as I know, judging from what Russia's saying, this does appear to be the biggest Ukrainian ground incursion into Russia of the war. They have supported cross-border raids launched by militias, including the Russian Volunteer Corps, which is a neo-Nazi militia made up of people who were born in Russia, and many of them went to fight for Kiev after the Donbass war broke out. Azov veterans, people like that. And they actually invaded Russia with U.S. armored vehicles, which is totally crazy. But I haven't... I've seen wreckage. Actually, there's wreckage and footage online of destroyed Ukrainian armored vehicles, and they include the Bradley fighting vehicles. So it looks like there is Ukraine is using U.S. provided weapons in an invasion of Russian territory. I laughed a little there. It's just, I say this a lot, but like a few years ago, if you were to tell me that, the U.S. would be supporting Ukraine, like ground incursions into Russian territory, like U.S. weapons and stuff would be used for that, I don't know if I would have believed you. It's just, it's just such a huge risk, this proxy war. But so Russia, they're saying that they're taking care of it in the sense that they haven't gone pushed too far through, but we'll see how it plays out in the next few days. And in the meantime, fighting continues along the front here. It seems like maybe this is an effort to stretch Russia's lines, but also this is, putting the Ukrainian forces pretty thin, and they have had some pretty serious manpower issues. So, we'll see how this plays out in the next few days. All right, so the next one here, the U.S. eyes remote Australian islands for a new base. So the U.S. is eyeing remote Australian islands as a potential location for a new military base as part of its buildup against China in the region. According to Defense One, the U.S. Navy recently published a construction tender that says the Cocos Islands, which are located over 1,300 miles to the west of Australia's mainland, can house infrastructure that can improve the U.S. military posture in the Indo-Pacific. So if they have published construction tenders, that means that they are planning construction on these islands. The U.S. Navy also listed the Philippines, Timor-Leste, and Papua New Guinea for anticipated construction projects under the Pacific Deterrence Initiative, which is the formal name for this U.S. military buildup in the region. So you see the map here. These islands are very far out in the Indian Ocean, far from Australia, closer to Indonesia, but they're way out there in the ocean. And the news of the U.S. plans to start construction on the Cocos Islands comes as Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin and Secretary of State Antony Blinken were hosting their Australian counterparts in Annapolis, Maryland. They held talks there. And after the meeting, Austin said that the U.S. would be increasing deployments to Australia and sending more bombers. He said, quote, "We're increasing the presence of rotational U.S. forces in Australia. All this will mean more maritime patrol aircraft and reconnaissance aircraft operating from bases across northern Australia. It will also mean more frequent rotational bomber deployments," end quote. So we learned in 2022 that the U.S. is building new facilities at the Tyndall Air Base, which is south of the northern city of Darwin, for the purpose of storing 6 nuclear-capable B-52 bombers. So it sounds like they want to keep some bombers there permanently. They always call things rotational, but, a lot of times it's on a multi-year basis, some of these deployments. The construction will cost about $100 million for these bomber facilities, and it's expected to be finished by 2026. And the U.S. is expanding its bases in the region explicitly in the name of preparing for a future war with China. There's no secret about that. I go back to this quote from General Kenneth Wilsbach. Right now, he's the head of Air Combat Command in the U.S. Air Force, but he said this when he was the head of U.S. Pacific Air Forces last year. He basically said, and he was talking about the Pacific Island nations in this instance, but he was saying in the region, the purpose of this expansion, the purpose of these new bases is to give China more targets that it would have to hit in a future war. He said, quote, "Obviously, we would like to disperse in as many places as we can to make the targeting problem for the Chinese as difficult as possible," end quote. So to all the Australians who listen to this show, of course, I really love Australia. I was just there recently. And people in these countries where the U.S. is building bases, they're going to become targets if there is a future war. So it's something people should really oppose, is the U.S. expanding its military on their territory. All right, so the next one here, FBI raids home of former UN arms inspector Scott Ritter. So on Wednesday, the FBI raided the home of Scott Ritter, a former UN weapons inspector who is known for correctly asserting at the time before the invasion of Iraq that Saddam Hussein did not have WMDs. And lately, he's been a very outspoken critic of the NATO proxy war in Ukraine and Israel's genocidal campaign in Gaza. The FBI raided his house. So Ritter told reporters outside of his New York home that the raid was related to a suspected violation of the Foreign Agents Registrations Act, FARA, a law that requires individuals or entities engaging in lobbying or other activity on behalf of a foreign country to register as foreign agents with the U.S. Department of Justice. He said, and this was a video posted on Twitter of him speaking to reporters right outside his house. He said, quote, "The search warrant is related to concerns apparently the U.S. government has about violations of the Foreign Agents Registration Act. I will tell you right now, I am not in violation of the Foreign Agents Registration Act, and hopefully by executing the search warrant and taking the information that they did, they will rapidly reach that conclusion, end quote. So this law, known as FARA for short, has been used to target people for political views before, and I linked to a story about them using it to target the Uhuru movement, which is like a black liberation movement, accusing them of, propaganda. I forget exactly what the accusation is here, but they're saying that FARA, the Foreign Registrations Act, it's a law that requires you to register with the DOJ if you're doing anything on behalf of a foreign country. And they're claiming that the Uhuru movement was doing so on behalf of Russia, but it's really just because of their political views. They claim that there's some Russian guy that they're tied to, means that they're being directed by the Russian government, but it doesn't look like there's any evidence of that, and it is just their political views about the war that they're being targeted for. And this is probably a similar thing that's happening with Ritter here. This law is selectively enforced. The best example of that is the fact that AIPAC is not registered under FARA, and that's not a violation somehow, even though they are explicitly lobbying to get more pro-Israel candidates elected. And I think their claim is, all of our money is American. All of our donors are American or whatever. But it's clear that they're acting on behalf of a foreign country. And Ritter, he said, he's also a former U.S. Marine Corps intelligence officer. He said there was no doubt he was being targeted for his political views and said the raid would have a chilling effect on free speech. He said the warrant allowed the FBI agents to look for electronic equipment and said that they were clearly interested in communications that he has with people related to his work. So he's a writer. He does a YouTube show. He appears on podcasts all the time. I saw later on in the day he put out a statement saying that they were primarily concerned with his writing for RT and Sputnik, which those are Russian state-funded media outlets. And I was afraid that they might go after people who work for RT or write for RT, using this law, in this post, with all the sanctions and stuff that they've imposed on Russia. So hopefully they don't try to, concoct something to get him with, because this is, he said it has a chilling effect on free speech. It certainly does, because, the allegation is that, I think what he said was that the allegation is that he's manipulating public opinion on behalf of a foreign government. But of course his position is, I'm an American and this is my position. And they pay me to write and do journalism that, he does on his own. That's dangerous, that, you're trying to manipulate public opinion on behalf of a foreign power. We're constantly accused of being, being on the payroll of the Russians or something. And this is accusation you always hear about people who oppose war, pro-Hamas. People always throw that at you as well. So definitely something to keep an eye on what happens with this. And he recently just had his passport seized by Customs and Border Patrol officers. He was boarding a plane from New York to Istanbul while he was on his way to Russia for the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. I know he was also in Russia recently. But he had his passport seized, and he said that when they seized it, that the officers said they were acting on behalf of the State Department. So that is it for the news for today. Please go check out our viewpoints. One from Jonathan Cook: Israel in a death spiral. Who will it take down with it? One from Brad Pierce: America's Syrian gulag, about the SDF prisons that they run. They're ISIS prisons, but there's also a lot of children and women in there, and there's torture and all sorts of horrific things going on in there. One from Christian G. Appy: blank checks for war, congressional abdication from Tonkin to Gaza. One from Doug Bandow: the Ukraine war effort is going nowhere fast. And one from Dan Leaf: Mrs. Max Boot, sometimes you get whacked by the revolving door. So please go check all of that out. You can always support this show by sharing it, Tell your friends about antiwar.com. Like, subscribe, comment. All that stuff helps. I appreciate everyone who does that and engages and shares, and everyone who watches and listens to the show. I will be back tomorrow. Thanks for listening.